The anomalies are what drives sort of science forward because you have to come up with a better theory that explains the anomalies. And if you come up with a better theory, they make these wild predictions. And if these wild predictions are true, this new theory can sort of supplant it. So the way Niels Bohr and the quanta supplanted sort of Einstein, even though he was brilliant. So the point is that that doesn't happen in medicine. In medicine, we have this super laborious process of evidence-based medicine, where instead of saying, hey, here's a theory that makes more sense because it explains everything, what they do is they say every single point, they go, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? So that's why nothing ever moves forward. Like I do the same thing in nephrology that I did 20 years ago when I was doing my training. It's like, what was the last advance we had, right? It's like so from so long ago. Where like most of the advances in medicine, for example, come from like aspirin. It counts for like 50% of the progress we've made. It's sort of ridiculous. Whereas physics sort of moves, at light speed because they don't demand this sort of evidence base. And I always say that, evidence based medicine is good if you know how to apply it, right? Because the whole point of evidence based medicine is that it's not a search for truth, it's a search for consensus. And it may or may not be true. But if you have a crazy theory and then you send it out to five people and they say, well, it's crazy, it gets killed. So if you have like a theory, hey, the earth goes around the sun, not the sun goes around the earth. You send it to a consensus of peers, they say, no, 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 no. Clearly the sun revolves around the earth. That would never have made it through. So the evidence-based medicine is not everything. Like you have to understand where to apply it. And this is where I think we've gotten into so much trouble is that every sort of advance moves glacially because we sort of demand that things have to have evidence. So something like fasting, for example, which I always get into trouble a lot too, right? I get into tons of trouble for calories. Everybody attacks me for all kinds of stuff. But fasting 5 years ago was the dumbest thing you could do, right? And I'm like, why? Like it doesn't make any sense that it should be so bad, right? So I thought about it and I went through it and then I just brought it immediately to patients, right? Just treated hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of patients and the results like amazing. And of course, if you don't eat, you're going to lose weight. If you don't eat, your diabetes is going to get better, right? So it worked. And that was the point. Like you got to get to that point where it's like, and then everybody says to me, oh, where's the evidence? I'm like, why do I need evidence? Like people are getting better, right? I'm not a researcher, right? You can come up with the research, but just try it on people, look at it. But all these people were saying, oh, there's no evidence, clearly it's bad. And that's where everything just sort of bogs down. You get all these people who sort of demand that every sort of little step has to be based on consensus. The consensus moves so slowly that you can't move. You can't move like Einstein moved. You can't make those sort of intuitive leaps forward. That always bothers me a lot.
Well, it's sort of a problem. There is a distinction, right? In physics, I think, broadly speaking, and again, physicists will sort of bristle at the simplicity with which I'm saying this, but you can generally divide the field into the experimentalists and the theorists. And that's what I think allows the step function changes in understanding. So Einstein's advances were theoretical. So the experimental evidence to support these things came after, but yes, many times the big steps forward come on the basis of theoretical propositions. And we don't really have that in medicine and biology. We don't have experimentalists and theorists. I've thought a lot about this actually, and I didn't intend to go down that rabbit hole, but there's a whole separate podcast, by the way, on this topic of how could you change biological research to take some of the advantages that we see in the physical sciences where you can create a symbiosis between the theorists and the experimentalists. The last thing I'll say on this point, by the way, that I agree with you is the real challenge of exclusively relying on evidence-based medicine is that framework is very good for certain problems. It's actually quite good for problems that are rather acute, for which the interventions to address them are rather simple, and for which you will get an answer quickly. So in many ways, the pillar of evidence-based medicine is infectious disease. If you think about how much we have learned through evidence-based medicine with respect to the treatment of HIV and, frankly, most infections, it's remarkable. I mean, we've really got that dialed in. But again, if you take a step back and look at those criteria, well, Infections are quite acute typically, very easy and binary to measure progression. The interventions are simple. Take this medication, don't take this medication. That's much more complicated than, well, I want you to exercise a certain way for this period of time, or I want you to eat a certain diet for a certain period of time. And then the resolution can be to whatever metric it is, whether it be T cell count or amelioration of the clinical infection. That occurs really quickly. So you're right. I mean, I think evidence-informed medicine is probably a better way to think about it. But yeah, someone like you is, you're really on the forefront of using your best ethical judgment to say, look, I'm going to bring something to a patient population. The other thing I want to add, by the way, while I'm on my soapbox that you helped me stand up onto, is people are very quick to say, well, you don't have the evidence to support fasting for a patient with type 2 diabetes. And you can say, okay, that's true. So there is a risk that if this patient with type 2 diabetes goes on a fasting protocol, something bad could happen. But what people in medicine I find are very, I wouldn't even say quick to forget, I don't even think it registers, is what's the risk of not doing something? The risk of doing something is usually more in our forefront. It's that risk of not doing something that people often forget. And if the risk of not doing something is stay the course, slowly increase the amount of insulin this patient requires, slowly watch the micro and macroscopic vascular disease progress, well, that risk's actually, that's a pretty bad risk.
Well, that's absolutely true. And it's like, this is the point that I always made to patients is like, if you keep on doing what it is that most doctors do, including myself, right? I used to just give people tons and tons of insulin. I know what is going to happen. And everybody acknowledges that you'll just get worse over time. And it was just sort of accepted. And it's like, there's the risk of not doing anything, right? But if you suddenly change, bring an intervention like fasting or low carbohydrate diets, ketogenic diets, or whatever, there's a risk of doing it. Sure, we don't know what the risks are, but we know the risk of not doing something. And that's the virtual certainty that you're going to, in 10 years, go on dialysis or something like that, right? And that's not an insignificant risk. It's actually a huge risk compared to doing fasting, which has been done for thousands of years. And I always say, look, the problem with evidence-based medicine and consensus and stuff, look at what happened with the low-carb guidelines. So, as you know, a couple of days ago, the American Diabetes Association came out with sort of new guidelines, and they said, hey, low carbohydrates pretty reasonable. It has the most evidence behind it. It's like 5 years ago, they're persecuting dietitians for giving low carb advice, right? It's like, the human body hasn't changed in the 5 years that it took for you to realize that, right? And that's where you're doing patients a real disservice by having these sort of expert opinions, guidelines, right, where people can't decide for themselves. Like as a dietitian, you can't decide for yourself that you want to be low carb because 5 years ago, they would have run you out and persecuted you, right? Taken away your license. And today, like as of sort of 2 days ago, you're actually falling completely within American Diabetes Association guidelines, right? So it's like, this is a big problem.
The flip side, I guess that's progress, and we'll take it, right? I've said this before. It's sort of one of my little tongue-in-cheek comments, but all facts have a half-life, and some of those half-lives can be quite short. But it is interesting to see this because it's been about 10 years that I've been paying attention to this, and these things typically do occur on 5-year cycles, both through the ADA, the AHA, and then in the United States, obviously the USDA also. I guess, in fact, gosh, it's hard to believe we're coming up to 2020. This time next year, we'll be dealing with a new set of dietary guidelines, which I don't want